Occupying a top spot on my Game of the Year list in 2023, Ys 10 Nordics is the latest entry in Falcom's long-running Ys franchise, and I wanted to talk about it. You see, while it's currently only available in Japan, there's little doubt that this game will be announced for a Western release at some point, and I wanted to share some technical details and thoughts on different versions of the game, including Switch, PS5, and PS4 Pro. I also wanted to take a closer look at the game's visuals, discuss its game design, and even stick a little bit of Ys history in there for good measure. Naturally, we'll determine if the Switch version is up to par this time, which was not necessarily the case with the prior two games. So with all that said, let's get into it. If you're not familiar with Ys, it's a long-running action RPG series that started life in 1987 on the NEC PC-88 series of personal computers. Each game puts you in the shoes of famous adventurer Adol Christen as you slash your way through challenges while following the many stories told within each game. The first three made their way to the West early on, arriving on systems such as the TurboGrafx-16, Super NES, and even the Sega Master System. The TurboGrafx version in particular was widely praised for its cinematic presentation and served as a very early showcase for CD-ROM technology. I mean, keep in mind, this is a game released in 1989. Games were still heavily limited by the internal sound hardware. CD technology meant that you could go from a game sounding like this on the NES to something like this. But of course, later entries push things even further. Large full-screen cutscenes, impressive voice acting, and so much more. But after Ys 3, the series basically vanished from Western shores. More Ys games were produced in Japan, including additional remakes as well as new numbered sequels. In the case of the fourth game, there were even two unique titles, Mask of the Sun on Super Famicom and The Dawn of Ys on PC Engine, which I am a huge fan of. In the early 2000s, however, Falcom finally unveiled the sixth entry, The Ark of Napishtim, which received ports to both PlayStation 2 and eventually PSP. I'm just happy the series managed to survive the awful CG movies that were created for the US release. It's like they hired the Eco box art guy to do them. Thankfully, there's a cheat code to restore the original animations, at least in the US version, not the European version. But those CG scenes are so bad, not to mention the voice acting, that it could have seriously prevented the series from continuing in the West. Thankfully, that did not happen, and the series did continue in the West, with various other companies handling localization duties. In time, between Ys and Trails in the Sky, Falcom finally achieved a new level of success around the world. Fast forward to September 2023, Falcom releases the latest entry in the series known as Ys 10 Nordics on PlayStation platforms and the Nintendo Switch. I picked up the game on launch day and loved it so much that it made my Game of the Year list last year. I played through it on PlayStation 5 initially, but over the holidays had a chance to play a chunk of the game on the Switch as well, and this allows me to give my thoughts on both versions, prior to their presumed arrival in the West. You see, for both Ys 8 and 9, I felt that the Switch versions of these games were not especially well done, but it's a series that lends itself to portable play. Also worth considering that Ys 8 and 9 were ported to Switch by external companies, whereas with Ys 10, Falcom themselves handled the conversion. Thus, I was hoping the Switch version this time around would improve things, and part of that hope stems from its underlying technology. While Ys 10 is pushing no visual boundaries, this game uses a new engine, which brings many nice improvements with it. You shouldn't expect cutting-edge technology here. After all, Falcom is a small studio, which kinda limits their potential in terms of visual accomplishment, but what they've delivered is still very attractive and a nice improvement over the prior two games. And that's key because with those two games, you could always feel that the underlying technology was built on a foundation targeting platforms such as the PlayStation Vita. Maps were often small, divided up into chunks with loading barriers between each section. Character movement felt somewhat stiff, and lighting, especially in the ninth game, felt extremely flat. With Ys 10, however, the size and scope of each section has increased significantly, with loading screens existing now primarily just between interiors and exteriors. The maps are more complex, more detailed, and more visually interesting. Now, given its setting, there's not that much variety in terms of locations, visually speaking, but it always looks excellent. Furthermore, animation is hugely improved across the board, with movement now feeling far less stiff than the prior two entries. The use of color is strong, with striking blue skies carrying you through the adventure, and major cutscenes receive actual quality animation work, which again was somewhat lacking in the past. Basically, while it very much looks like something you'd expect to play on Nintendo Switch, it feels more attractive and polished all around, while delivering a game that just feels better to play. Moving Adol, attacking enemies, and using his various mana powers are all satisfying. So how does it fare from a visual and performance standpoint? Well, unsurprisingly, the PS5 version seems to be the best of the bunch. It runs at native 4K at 60 frames per second while completely eliminating loading times. They even remove the loading screens entirely, which you'll see in other versions. A great touch. This is the version I played through and the one I would recommend. However, the Switch version has its own appeal, and I wanted to check it out on the go. As noted, the last two games did not run well on Switch at all, and initial impressions of Ys 10 on the Switch suggested that it might also be the case here, but thankfully, things do even out, and after many hours of play, I found that it's a largely acceptable, but not necessarily amazing experience. So let's break it down. Well, firstly, there's the image quality, which takes a hit as expected. The game runs at 900p in docked mode and around 600p in portable. The resolution is expected for the Switch, and it looks fine enough in this regard, I'd say. But alas, visual cuts were also necessary, despite the somewhat simplistic designs, which did surprise me. For instance, there's this nice mix of bloom and volumetric lighting that you often see in the PS5 version, and that seems to have gone completely missing on Switch, leading to scenes that can look a little darker than they should. Shadows are also much lower resolution, with a lot of visual breakup and noise if you look closely, especially on self-shadows. Of course, shadows are always something you want to turn down to gain back extra performance, so I can understand that one. Texture filtering also exhibits additional blur at oblique angles. I also noticed other things such as water rendering differing between the two, or things like pop-in, which is often much worse on Switch, with nearby objects just appearing out of thin air. So while it does overall preserve the visual identity of the game, it does feel like perhaps too many little things were cut. So it's definitely a sloppier experience than the PS5 version. But the performance is perhaps what matters most. Now keep in mind that Ys 8 and 9 on the Switch both exhibit pretty serious frame rate issues throughout, making those ports a suboptimal way to play. Ys 10 in comparison manages to reach a much more stable 30 frames per second most of the time, but there are specific effects, especially of the alpha variety, that can cause the performance to dip pretty sharply. That is the primary issue here. Alpha effects. Whether it's cutscenes or battle or anything else, the Switch's mobile hardware does not play nicely with transparency, and the frame rate drops hard whenever they appear. But thankfully, despite this, the Switch version of 10 is overall far more consistent and better than the last two games. It's not perfect, but it's significantly improved. Curiously, there's also a PlayStation 4 version of the game. I don't have the whole game, but there is a demo to download, and what's interesting is that when played on a PS4 Pro, they actually went back and included some modes. Specifically the option to cap the frame rate at 30 frames per second, or simply run with it unlocked. And the game does hold 30 frames per second very well from initial testing, as you would expect. But the unlocked mode feels remarkably unstable in areas with lots of enemies or NPCs. I can understand why they included the option, but it's disappointing that it was necessary. The visuals were also slightly pared back as well, falling somewhere between the Switch and PS5 version, and it runs at 1080p. Given all of this information, it suggests that the game is likely most limited by the CPU as opposed to the GPU. The Switch, I can understand, but the PS4 Pro should do better, I think. I did not get a chance to try it on the base PS4 though, but I gather that the 30 FPS mode is the default way to play that version. At least the game is buttoned up nicely on the PS5, which is the preferred way to go. But of course, there's also a chance that this stuff could all improve by the time it appears in the West. So the thing to take away from it at the moment is to consider that at least all versions are quite playable, if slightly flawed on the older machines. Beyond the technology though, I also wanted to discuss the game's structure and design, at least a little bit. You see, the multi-character system from the East games starting with 7 started to become old by the prior game, I think. With East 10, Falcon went for a much more focused design thanks to the cross-action system. You see, this time, you'll primarily control 2 characters, Adol and Kaja. You can switch between the two with a single button, but the main draw here are the combo attacks. You can basically mix normal attacks, skills, and these combo attacks, which produce some pretty awesome combos that feel great to pull off. You also gain access to mana powers during the game, which grants you special abilities such as the mana string, which works like a grappling hook, the mana ride, where you jump on what is effectively a hoverboard known as the Grimble board, or the mana burst, which allows you to summon special attacks that can even be used in puzzle solving. And thinking of puzzles, that ties into the world design itself. You see, this game is broken up into a series of islands that you explore by way of the Sandras, a large naval vessel you'll command throughout the game. You can also upgrade the ship, by the way. Now, as you progress through the game, you'll begin to uncover the map while visiting many new locations, basically different islands. These islands can include towns, dungeons, and various other things. But the sailing between these kind of reminded me of something like Skies of Arcadia's airship sequences, and it feels like a proper old-school overworld map, which is something I really loved. There's also ship-to-ship combat and even ship boarding mechanics in there for good measure. Basically, it's one of those games that feels like a whimsical adventure. Taking your party out on the open seas and exploring these new islands is admittedly a lot of fun. And perhaps more than many other East games, the storytelling in this one is pretty great. It feels like more of a personal story and features some surprising twists along the way, especially near the end. If you're thinking of giving this a try and you're decent with Japanese, but still need to look up words from time to time, as is definitely the case for me, East 10 features a robust log system as well that catalogs all the dialogue. You can basically review any lines you may have missed, including replaying the associated voice clips. I found this feature extremely handy. And speaking of audio-related topics, there's also the game's soundtrack, which in typical Falcom fashion is of great quality with a nice mix of driving, energetic tunes and calmer melodies. How about a sample? But yeah, needless to say, I enjoyed this game a lot, and I can't wait to hear what others think when it comes west. It's a beautiful, enjoyable, and very fun action RPG with perhaps the best gameplay in the series' history. Yeah, it has its flaws and it's not pushing any technical boundaries, but what's here is solid and enjoyable. Beyond that, I also hope you enjoyed this video. I kind of view it like one of those old school articles covering import games in the back of gaming magazines during the 90s. You know, like a preview of what's to come, something to get excited about. So in its current form, it's pretty clear that the PS5 version is the way to go for this game if you have the choice, but compared to the prior games, at least the Switch version is a little bit better. I'll also be curious to see if they decide to bring the PS4 version of the game to the West as well. And heck, maybe we'll even get a PC port. But that's gonna do it for now. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time.